Kyle Pitts has a fifth-year option in 2025, but let's talk about his potential in the Falcons' new look offense in 2024.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. So, guys, if you don't know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman. Been covering the Falcons for far too long, formerly at FalcFans.com, RIP. You may also know me as Mr. Drew, Sirius Black, a.k.a. the Jolly Green Giant, a.k.a. the iron that sharpens the iron, a.k.a. Mr. a.k.a. And I appreciate each and every one of you that have made this illustrious podcast your first listen or first watch of the day, right? Shout out to my everydayers. And if you want to become an everydayer, all you got to do is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So later on today's episode, we'll talk about the Falcons' 10 new undrafted free agents, a little bit about those guys, not a whole lot, which remaining holes on the roster need to be plugged. But the bulk of today's conversation will be about Kyle Pitts, who just got a fifth-year option extended to him officially on Monday. He'll earn $10.878 million in the 2025 season, fully guaranteed. And this was expected. We talked with Josh Kendall at the beginning of the offseason, talking about the over 90% probability that the Falcons would give Kyle Pitts the fifth-year option. So that did happen. Now, before we can get into Kyle Pitts' potential in this offense, let's talk a little bit about fifth-year options, because there does seem to be a little bit of confusion that I found from folks to sort of explain what they actually are and how they work, because I think a lot of people are assuming they work the same way they worked in the old collective bargaining agreement, or CBA, versus the new one that was signed in 2020. And under the old system, you could get out of a fifth-year option after you gave it to a player, right? Because they were only guaranteed for injury, right? And there are two types of guarantees in the NFL when it comes to contracts: injury guarantees and fully guaranteed contracts. Injury guarantees mean that the player still gets his money if he's hurt. Fully guaranteed means doesn't matter what happens to the player, he's still going to get his money. And the fifth-year options are decided only after a player's third season, and it only applies to first-round picks. Pitts just finished his third year. Next year, the Falcons will have to decide right immediately after the draft whether or not they're going to give that fifth-year option to Drake London, which seems likely at this point. The year after that, it'll depend. Bijan will be up for one, and then the year after that, in 2027, it will be the Michael Penix decision. Now, with the new CBA that was signed in 2020, it changed how fifth-year options work. You may recall, prior to the new CBA being signed in 2020, back in 2019, the Falcons potentially could have gotten out of their fifth-year option with Vic Beasley, right, where they were going to pay him approximately $13 million in that 2019 season, because that was only guaranteed for injury, and because Beasley was healthy, they could have cut him before the 2019 season and owed him nothing. But you can't do that in the new CBA, right? Once you give out the fifth-year option, it's on the books no matter what. There's one exception, though. That is if you trade the player before he goes into his fifth year, right? Because with trades, the new team will take on that money that you previously owed them. So in this instance, let's hypothetically say Kyle Pitts has a bad 2024 season, and then the Falcons are like, look, we can do better than this. And they decide to trade him next offseason. And the new team would take on that $10.87 million that the Falcons would owe him in 2025. However, the plausibility of such a trade is only really realistic at the beginning of the offseason, when typically teams are flush with cap space in order to take on such a high, hefty contract, a hefty salary at that point. And this matters because, teams can't get out of it. And so you'll probably see less teams pick up the fifth-year option, right? This is why we mentioned before, when we discussed the possibility of the Falcons trading for Justin Fields, right? It was unlikely that the acquiring team, now the Steelers, would pick up his fifth-year option. They haven't officially made their decision as of yet, because, it would fully guarantee over $25 million in Justin Fields' case, on a player that you don't really know if he's good or not, right? And this is worth keeping in mind for potentially 3 years down the road in 2027, when the Falcons have to make a similar decision with Michael Penix, right? That presumably if Michael Penix does start in 2026, the Falcons will basically have a single season to decide whether or not Michael Penix is worth whatever that price tag is going to be, which I'm sure we can guesstimate is probably somewhere north of $25 million, probably somewhere in the $30 million range by the time we get to that point. And so, if he's up and down that first year as a starter in 2026, that potentially could create a dilemma, because if the Falcons don't pick up their fifth-year option, then 2027 would be the last year of his rookie contract. And then you would have to get into, franchise tags and things could get pretty messy. But we'll obviously cross that bridge if and when we get to it. But I just want to inform people of that, because I know a lot of people, seem to be not understanding how fifth-year options and sort of thinking them as like, oh, low risk propositions. You can extend them and then you can always take them away. And that's not the case anymore. That used to be the case. That has not been the case for the last 4 years. So Kyle Pitts probably will be an Atlanta Falcon. But we'll leave the salary cap and contract logistics aside, and let's get into the conversation about what Kyle Pitts could look like in 2024. And make his case for why trading him in the future is a non-issue, and we'll break that down as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. Passion, drive, and patience. It is the winning formula for winning championships, and it's also the formula that's going to keep your ride or die alive. And eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance, from superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and so much more. And it doesn't matter if you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time, or your money back, because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash, baby. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guarantee Fit only available to U.S. customers. And guys, it is the most exciting time of the year because it's playoff time in the NBA. And Gametime is an authorized ticket marketplace of the NBA, which is going to make getting tickets even faster and easier. Prices on Gametime app actually go down the closer it gets a tip off. And unfortunately, there isn't playoff basketball in Atlanta. But if you find yourself in a city where there is, or, if you find yourself where, there's other sports, comedy, music, theater near you, Gametime is going to allow you to be spontaneous, right? You can save up to 60% on last minute deals. They're all in prices, means you're not going to get hit with surprise fees at checkout. And of course, you're going to get that panoramic view from your seat before you buy, so you know exactly what to expect before you show up. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL, LOCKEDONNFL, for $20 off. That's download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. So I want to plug Locked On Sports today, where you're getting the can't miss analysis, opinions, and news streaming 24/7 on YouTube for free, as well as the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So let's talk about Kyle Pitts and what he can do in 2024 in the Zac Robinson offense. We already had these conversations on the podcast back in January and March, but I know not everyone out there is an everydayer. What are you doing with your life? And, even the everydayers every now and then need a refresher, right? So much has happened in the last couple of days that I can understand. Like what did Aaron say about Kyle Pitts back on like March 19th, right? But, as I mentioned then, I think this is kind of a make or break year for Kyle Pitts, right? Not because the Falcons could trade him next year, but just simply because, like, if he doesn't have a big year, and we'll talk about all the reasons why I think he's set up to have a big year, then, it would mean that maybe the Falcons will be looking at a different direction next year at the tight end position. All right. Now, we've talked before about how Kyle Pitts could be used more as, or I expect Kyle Pitts to be used more as an inline tight end this year, right? That if you look at his career snaps, only about 20% of his passing down snaps have come where he's had his hand in the dirt. And last year, I think it was a career low at like 15%. And comments from Zac Robinson, the Falcons offensive coordinator, and their new tight ends coach, Kevin Koger, in my opinion, sort of read that they see Pitts more as a quote unquote traditional tight end, And traditional tight ends typically see 35 to 50% of their snaps in line. That's pretty normal in the NFL. And the other expectation I have with Kyle Pitts and his changing role is he's going to be used a lot more on underneath routes rather than the deep routes that were a staple of the Arthur Smith offense, right? We talked about this before, right? Arthur Smith's offense was backwards in the sense that he, a traditional NFL offense is going to use wide receivers to spread defenses vertically and then have tight ends, eat underneath, so to speak. And the Falcons were like, we're going to have Kyle Pitts spread defense vertically and we'll have our wide receivers eat underneath. Kyle Pitts is the type of tight end due to his unique nature as a unicorn, that sort of rare gifted, type of runner that you could theoretically do this with. But this, to me, was a contributing factor to why Pitts' production was so inconsistent game to game and year to year, right? In the last 2 years, especially, he was less effective being that vertical spread tight end because of the poor play of Marcus Mariota overthrowing him a bunch. And in this past year, because he was injured, and so he was less effective running those vertical routes than he was earlier in his career when he was, the knee was 100%. I also think the drop in inline production is also related to the knee injury because he doesn't have as much power coming out of a 3-point stance as he would coming out, accelerating into his routes out of a 2-point stance. And that contributed not only as a receiver as well as a blocker as well. But I think you're going to see a larger percentage of Pitts' targets be underneath, less than 10 yards, traveling less than 10 yards in the air, which is pretty common in the NFL, right? The norm for most tight ends in the NFL is over 60% of their targets are going to be less than 10 yards traveling in the air. Pitts, over his career, has only had 45% of his targets travel less than 10 yards in the air, right? And you compare that to how the Rams have utilized their tight ends under Sean McVay. And we've talked before about how Jared Everett is the closest analog you can find to a tight end with Kyle Pitts' athletic skill set that McVay has had in the offense. And 72% of his targets were less than 10 yards in the air in the 2019 and 2020 seasons when he was a featured part of that offense. Also, 53% of his snaps were in line during those seasons. During that same span of years, Tyler Higbee, 75% of his targets traveled less than 10 yards in the air. You also look at how TJ Hockenson is used in a McVay derivative offense under Kevin O'Connell in Minnesota. I would love to see Kyle Pitts use more like TJ Hockenson, more on that a little bit later. Hockenson spends about 50% of his snaps in line, and since joining the Vikings, about 73% of his targets have been underneath throws, less than 10 yards in the air. You can also look at Zach Taylor's offense in Cincinnati when he's had CJ Uzomah and Hayden Hurst getting targets in 21 and 22, right? 88% of Uzomah's targets were underneath. 79% of Hayden Hurst's targets were underneath. Although, Jamar Chase has a lot to do with that. And, no offense to Drake London, I don't think we have a Jamar Chase right now in the offense. But what does all this mean, right? I'm sure you're listening to this or watching this and you're saying, Aaron, you're throwing a lot of numbers at me. I don't understand what they mean. I'm going to take them as a sign of disrespect. Well, essentially, my guy, right? A 5-yard pass is easier to complete than a 15-yard pass. Right. And so if Pitts is running more shorter routes that are like going 5 yards, it should be easier to get him the ball, right? Rather than it has been the last couple of years where it's a lot of 15 and 20 and 25-yard passes, right? And those harder passes down the field are much more dependent on the caliber of quarterback, which is part of the reason why in his rookie year for a handful of games when Matt Ryan was cooking, him and Pitts were cooking, he was very productive in a handful of games, and we haven't really seen that repeat itself the last couple of years in part due to the decline in quarterback play as well as the injuries, right? So that's why I expect this year to be a big year for Kyle Pitts. This is why I say it's a make or break year for him, because essentially if he doesn't perform in a scheme that should theoretically, again, based off my expectations, benefit him, then we might have to have a conversation after next season, and that conversation may involve trade speculation. But we're months away from me giving any sort of stat projection. We're months away from having that conversation. We're also months away from me giving any sort of stat projections for this year's Falcons offense. But if you go back to those 7-game span where TJ Hockenson was the breadwinner of the Vikings offense when Justin Jefferson was hurt last year, And if the Falcons utilize Pitts to the same degree that the Vikings utilize Hockenson, where him and Jordan Addison were kind of the 1-2 punch of that offense, and I would imagine Drake would be the 1 and Pitts would be the 2. But theoretically, if you ran your offense through Kyle Pitts in the ways that so many of us would like to see in order to quote unquote justify his draft selection a couple of years ago, which is is all that anybody cares about, is like, you got to live up to the 4th round draft pick. That's all that I care about. But anyway, Hockenson during that 7-game span got 28% of the Vikings targets during that span. And if you extrapolate that over an average NFL season, for if the Falcons are an average offense this year and throw the ball about 575 times, right, that would lead to roughly 160 targets for Kyle Pitts this year, right? The most ever we've seen from a tight end, at least since, targets were being tracked in like the 90s or whenever it was, is 156 for Zach Ertz in 2018 with the Eagles. So to me, that is the upper end of Kyle Pitts' potential production in this offense. I think a realistic upper end of what he could do. It's very early on that, so I'm not projecting him to have some sort of historic season where he's setting records for targets or anything like that. But I would guess, again, it's still early, but I would guess will probably, a ballpark figure will somewhere be in that like 120 targets range, which would still be a career high for Kyle Pitts after I think 110 he had his rookie season. So, I would recommend for anybody who's, gets bored in a couple of weeks or months, that is, inclined to go and watch film, like, like a snob or something like that. If you can go watch those 7 games between week 6 and week 12 of the Vikings last year, where Justin Jefferson was out, and pay attention to how to utilize Hockenson. I gained a new respect for both Hockenson and Kevin O'Connell last year in the lead up to the Falcons week 9 game, because that was during that time, watching how they sort of featured Hockenson in the offense and made him sort of the number 1 weapon. And we kind of talked about going into that week 9 game. I think we mentioned the key to victory for the Falcons was slowing down TJ Hockenson. They didn't really slow him down all that much, which was a contributing factor to why they lost the game, and in addition to their inability to tackle quarterbacks. I guess more on that later, more on slowing down Hockenson. But I will say this, Richie Grant played reasonably well in that game. He had 2 pass breakups in man coverage against TJ Hockenson. And that's part of the reason why I'm not as down on Richie Grant as other people are in terms of that. But speaking of being down on Richie Grant, let's talk about some of the positions like edge rusher that can help you tackle a Josh Dobbs, theoretically, safety that can help you cover a TJ Hockenson, as well as cornerback, are some of the spots that are still left with question marks coming out of the draft, right? And we'll also talk about we'll briefly talk about the undrafted free agents that the Falcons added Tuesday to close out today's Locked On Falcons. So guys, you may be beside yourself because of choices that the Atlanta Falcons made, recently in the NFL draft, or you may be overjoyed, but this is the time, whether you need a pick-me-up or whatever, you need your friends now more than ever. And with Monopoly Go, you can team up with friends for time tournaments where you work together to build up each other's boards. And the more you win together, the more awesome the prizes that you can unlock, such as unique stickers that you can trade with friends to complete albums, cool new playing pieces, hilarious emojis for taunting your friends when you smash their buildings or heist their vaults. Plus, Monopoly Go feels new and exciting every day with constantly changing tournaments and challenges. A ton include their own unique mini games like digging for treasure or robot pachinko machine. And there's new timed events that help you win big, like massive multipliers for everything you win or rent frenzies. There's always something fun to discover in Monopoly Go, so get off the bench and download it now for free on Google Play or the App Store. Game on. So let me plug the Locked On Falcons podcast, where we're looking to pass 10,000 subscribers. I didn't look before I jumped in and record to see if we had done that. I think we were like 20 away. So let's do that. Let's get that done before May 1st, before the clock strikes midnight tonight on May 1st, so we can get to 10,000. Please, appreciate you guys. Tomorrow's episode, I believe, we'll be joined by Damian Parson of Locked On NFL Draft. We'll get his thoughts on the Falcons draft class on tomorrow's episode. But let's wrap up talking a little bit about the Falcons undrafted free agents. They signed 10 officially on Tuesday. Looking over the list of names, nobody notable stood out to me. None of those guys were rated high enough by Dane Brugler in his Beast to have a write-up on them, and he wrote up over 400 prospects in the Beast. And so, I don't feel inclined to be like, oh, this guy is worthwhile. Again, we'll see. But later this summer, once I get through the draft class, I might go and watch the tight end that they signed from Oklahoma, a couple of the offensive linemen, a cornerbacks that they signed. They signed 3 corners and two tackles, one of whom may move to guard. We'll see. But, because I feel like the guys at those spots are probably have the best chance of potentially, if they come in and ball out during camp, they have a slim chance of maybe sneaking onto the 53-man roster. The tight end offensive line, you don't have as much proven depth at those 2 spots. Once you get past Kyle Pitts and Charlie Warner, we'll see what John Fitzpatrick can do this year. The offensive line, you have basically one proven backup in Storm Norton. If you want to throw Ryan Newsel into the mix, sure. But, it's possible that maybe one of these guys could sneak on as, like the 10th guy on the offensive line or something like that. And then cornerback, I think you'll have an opportunity if you can carve out a role on special teams that maybe you could sneak onto this roster as a CB6. But speaking of relatively thin areas of the roster, let's talk about edge, corner, and safety as the 3 positions that the Falcons did not address in the draft that I think a lot of people thought they would. Okay, technically they did address edge in the draft, but didn't necessarily get the massive upgrade that I think a lot of people were expecting in round 1 for obvious reasons. And I wonder what happened in round 1. If only someone did a daily podcast talking about it every single day for the last 3 days and the next 3 years. Sorry. Did I sound bitter when I said that? I didn't mean to come off bitter, but we know the Falcons need pass rush help. It's just talking about the pass rush. It makes me bitter. We've talked before how Grady Jarrett and David Onyemata are probably going to be expected to carry the pass rush. You're going to need a big jump from Arnold Ebiketie this year. But, we always talk about you got to be able to get pressure with 4. Okay, so 3 of the 4 spots, we kind of know who are going to be the guys. Who's that 4th guy going to be? And right now, it's kind of a toss-up between Lorenzo Carter, their rookie Braylon Trice, Brandon Dorless potentially getting some looks on the edge. Zach Harrison, will he get some looks on the edge? James Smith-Williams or D'Angelo Malone? And, again, your mileage may vary, but like for me, none of those choices inspire really any confidence that 4th guy is going to be able to provide reliable pressure. This is why you've heard me talk about like, man, this looks an awful lot like the 2022 Falcons pass rush, with David Onyemata instead. I think this is why a lot of people sort of think they'll bring back Bud Dupree. I'm skeptical of that now that they've drafted these guys, but Bud Dupree is a known commodity, and I don't feel some type of way about the fact that we all kind of went into this offseason thinking that we would get a better option than Bud Dupree this offseason, and now we're like, hey, Bud Dupree, come and save us. Isn't that awesome? Isn't a great place to be as a Falcon fan? We're doing well, aren't we, guys? But, the Falcons could obviously get some veteran help. You got guys like Yannick Ngakoue, Carl Lawson, Jerry Hughes, Marcus Golden, Justin Houston, Emmanuel Agba, Melvin Ingram out there. A lot of those guys kind of fell off this past year. Ngakoue is probably the only guy that you could expect to have a significant role, but he's been on the decline. He got hurt at the end of last year, so he finished, I think he hurt his ankle, so he finished on IR. His pass rush win rates have been on steady decline the last 3 years, to the point of the last 2 years, like they aren't any significantly better than like Lorenzo Carter's. So we'll see about that. I know a lot of people are like, hey, let's trade for Trey Hendrickson. And I say, you're not going to trade for Trey Hendrickson, unlike Hassan Reddick, where, the Falcons didn't trade for that guy and he was available. Trey Hendrickson, by all accounts, at least based off of the Bengals people that cover that team, Trey Hendrickson's not available. From what I understand, his situation is kind of similar to the Julio situation towards the end, when he was had like 3 years left on his contract, and he was like, give me a new deal. They gave him an extension last year. He wants a new deal. He's got 2 years left on his contract. The Bengals are like, no, he's been threatening retirement. The Bengals are like, okay, we'll see. Like, you got $31 million that you're going to get paid the next 2 years. So if you want to stop playing football because you're not happy with $31 million, then, good luck to you. So basically, Trey Hendrickson, what I'm saying is this year, at least, Trey Hendrickson will either be playing for the Bengals or nobody at all. So I don't think that's a realistic option for the Falcons. I do think maybe slightly more realistic options, if they're going to trade for anybody, or maybe some guys that are going into contract years on rookie deals. Malcolm Kuntz, we talked a little bit about with the Raiders. That was a trade proposed by Bill Barnwell a couple of weeks ago. Azeez Ojulari, it would be a nice homecoming for him. He's been limited by injuries the last couple of years in New York, and they just picked up Brian Burns, and so he's now a backup on that team. Could definitely be a starter here in Atlanta. Joe Tryon-Shoyinka has a connection with Jimmy Lake from their Washington days. Tampa Bay added Randy Gregory and Chris Braswell this offseason. He's kind of been lost in the shuffle. Joe Tryon-Shoyinka the last year, they're kind of down on him. He's probably going to be a backup this year potentially. Now, obviously, it's a intra-division trade, so maybe that's less likely, but that one, to me, makes the most sense if the Falcons are going to do a deal, or Azeez Ojulari if they want. So, talking corner, veterans out there available: J.C. Jackson, Akello Witherspoon, who played with the Rams last year, Steven Nelson, Stephon Gilmore, Adoree Jackson. Our old favorite Fabian Moreau is also out there. My guess is the Falcons will be pretty content at this spot, maybe more so than the others. I imagine they're going to want to see what Clark Phillips can do, especially now that the Falcons are presumably moving to a zone-heavy scheme, and we talked about that. One of the reasons why I was down on Clark Phillips more so than other people were after we drafted him is because I didn't love his fit in a press man scheme like Ryan Nielsen had, but in a zone-heavy scheme, like, this is perfect for Clark Phillips, assuming he can improve his tackling. That's the key. You got to get better at tackling, my guy, if you're going to be a starting corner in the NFL and basically cover guys that are all like 210 pounds. So we'll see about that. As for edge, I should mention this as well. I'm not expecting the Falcons to rush out and sign an edge rusher. My guess is that they'll probably let the rookies see what they have in Trice and Dorless in camp and give those guys a legit shot to show out. And if they do, then they'll just kind of roll into the season with one of those guys being the fourth edge rusher, the fourth rusher. And if they don't, then maybe we'll see them be a little bit more proactive in August. But I would absolutely love to be wrong, to see the Falcons not be complacent with their pass. Oh man, did I just die and go to heaven? Oh, goodness gracious. I would love to see that. But I do think one position that probably of these three, edge, corner, and safety is probably the one that I would guess is probably most likely to potentially get an upgrade. You have several guys that have coaching connections with this coaching staff: John Johnson, Rudy Ford, Adrian Amos, Eddie Jackson, the Ryan Pace. I don't know where Ryan Pace is at right now in the building, but he's somewhere, lurking, trying to get some more Bears on this roster like Amos and Eddie Jackson. You also, of course, have big names like Quandre Diggs, Justin Simmons, Marcus May is also out there. As I mentioned before, I'm not as down on Richie Grant as other people are. I think ideally he'd be a dime safety rather than a starter. And right now, him and DeMarco Hellams would be in the mix to be starters this year. I do think part of that is due to, he had a smaller role in the second half of the season, and I actually think he played better. Again, that won't get any credit for Richie Grant, that outside of that Cardinals game, from that Vikings game onward, he played his best football of the season. Part of that was due to having a more reduced role, I think, and part of that, which is why I think he'd be an ideal dime safety for the Falcons, and thus why it would make sense for the Falcons to go out there and get someone who can start for them to allow that to happen. But I know, people tend to think that, hey, if you're bad in the first 5 games of the season, you're always bad. I remember this happened with Brian Poole, where he whiffed on that tackle in like week 2 or 3 against the Saints in 2018, and everybody's like, he sucks. And then he went out in the second half of that season and arguably was our best corner in the second half of the season, and then went on to have 2 or 3 more successful years with the Jets. And so like you have to watch all the games, guys, rather than just having your emotional reaction in week 5 about what the season is going to be. But that will be a conversation we'll have maybe in November or something like that, but we'll see. But that is going to do it for us, guys. We'll see if the Falcons address any of these holes. We'll see if any of these undrafted free agents are worth a damn, and we'll see what Kyle Pitts' season could wind up being with a changing role in 2024. But that's going to do it for us here on today's Locked On Falcons. Check out tomorrow, where we should be joined by Damian Parson of the Locked On NFL Draft to talk about his thoughts on the Falcons draft class. Check out Locked On NFL Draft for Damian and Keith's thoughts on the rest of the league's draft class. The Locked On NFL also has you covered. Locked On NFL Scouting with the Draft News with Joe Marino and Kyle Krabs. And of course, Locked On Sports Today on the 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube, as well as the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. It's all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.